Hello, classmates. Welcome to International Trade class. This lecture, we will discuss import quota and voluntary export restraint. Tariffs are the simplest trade policies, but in the modern world, most government intervention in international trade also takes other forms, such as import quota, voluntary export restraint, and export subsidies, etc. Fortunately, once we have understood tariffs, it's not too difficult to understand other trade instruments. This section, we will introduce import quota and voluntary export restraint. Import quotas are limitations on the quantity of goods that can be imported into the country within a given time period. There are two types of import quotas: absolute quota and tariff rate quota. An absolute quota is a physical restriction on the quantity of goods that can be imported during a specific time period, normally a year. The quota generally limits imports to a level below what would occur under free trade conditions. For example, an absolute quota might state that no more than 1 million kilograms of cheese or 20 million kilograms of wheat can be imported during some specific time period. To administer the quota, the government allocates import license to importers, permitting them to import the product only up to a prescribed limit, regardless of market demand. Absolute quotas can be either global quotas or selective quotas or country quotas. Global quotas are quotas established on the basis of the total quantity, which are generally administered on a first-come, first-served, without reference to countries of origin. For this reason, many quotas are filled shortly after the opening of the quota period. Selective quotas are quotas of imports reserved for a specific country. For instance, a country might impose a quota of 30 million apples per year, of which 14 million must come from the United States, 10 million from Mexico, and 6 million from Canada. So the importer is usually required to submit certificates of origin. Following World War II, absolute quotas were a popular form of protectionism as countries sought to strictly limit the quantity of imports. However, as the world moved towards trade liberalization in the 1960s and the 1970s, absolute quotas were removed from international trade in the manufactured goods. By the 1990s, absolute quotas were phased out of trade in agricultural goods and replaced by tariff rate quotas. A tariff rate quota displays both tariff-like and quota-like characteristics. It permits a specified quantity of imported merchandise to be entered at a lower tariff rate, the within quota rate, whereas any imports above this level face a higher tariff rate, the over quota rate. Therefore, there is no absolute limitation on the amount of the product that may be imported during the quota period. A tariff rate quota has two components: a quota that defines the maximum volume of imports and charges the within quota tariff, and an over quota tariff. For example, in 2013, the U.S. imposed a tariff rate quota on the imported milk. The within-quota tariff rate was $0.32 per liter. However, the over-quota tariff rate was $0.885 per liter, and the import quota threshold was 5.7 million liters. We can see the over-quota tariff rate was much higher than within-quota tariff rate. The tariff rate quota appears to differ later from the absolute quota. The distinction is that under an absolute quota, it's legally impossible to import more than a specified amount. In principle, under tariff rate quota, imports can exceed this specified amount, but a higher over-quota tariff is applied on the excess. Like a tariff, an absolute quota affects an economy's welfare. Let's take the import quota of U.S. sugar as an example. Suppose the United States is a small nation in terms of the world sugar market. That is, the imposing quota would not have a significant effect on the world sugar price. Look at Figure 1. Assume the world price is PW, so under free trade, the U.S. will import D1 minus S1 tons of sugar from the world. Now the U.S. imposes quota of Q on the imported sugar. Because the domestic supply plus import quota is less than the domestic demand. As a result, the price of sugar in the U.S. increases to PQ, higher than the world price in the outside world. The increase in price will lead to a reduction in U.S. sugar consumption from D1 to D2, and an increase in U.S. sugar production from S1 to S2. So the consumer surplus falls by the area indicated A plus B plus C plus D, and the producer surplus rises by the area labeled A. The area A represents the redistributive effect, which is the transfer of consumer surplus to producer surplus. Area B represents the protective effect, and area D represents the consumption effect. The deadweight loss, efficiency loss of welfare to the economy resulting from the quota is depicted by the protective effect plus the consumption effect, B plus D. But what about revenue effect, denoted by area C? With a quota, the government receives no revenue. When a quota instead of a tariff is used to restrict imports, the sum of money that would have appeared with a tariff as government revenue is corrected by whoever receives the import license. License holders are thus able to buy imports and sell them at a higher price in the domestic market. The profits received by the holders of import license are known as quota rents or windfall profits. In assessing the costs and benefits of import quota, it's crucial to determine who gets the rents. When the right to sell in the domestic market are assigned to governments of exporting countries, as is often the case, the transfer of rents abroad makes the cost of a quota substantially higher than the equivalent tariff. Alternatively, the government may correct the quota's revenue from the importing companies. Suppose the government sells import license to importers. By charging for permission to import, the government receives some or all of the quotas win for profit. If import licenses are auctioned off to the highest bidder in a competitive market, the government will capture all the windfall profit. A variant of the import quota is the voluntary export restraint, VER, also known as a voluntary restraint agreement, VRA. A VER is a quota on trade imposed from the exporting country's side instead of the importers. The most famous example is the limitation on auto exports to the United States enforced by Japan after 1981. Voluntary export restraints are generally imposed at the request of the importer and are agreed to by the exporter to forestall other more stringent trade restrictions. From an economical point of view, a voluntary export restraint is exactly like an import quota, except being implemented by the exporting nation and is therefore very costly to the importing country. A VER is always more costly to the importing country than a tariff that limits imports by the same amount. The difference is that what would have been revenue under tariff becomes rents earned by foreigners under VER, so that the VER clearly produces a loss for the importing country. A study of the effects of the three major U.S. voluntary export restraints of the 1980s in textiles and apparel, steel, and automobiles found that about 67% of the cost to consumers of these restraints was accounted for by the rents earned by foreigners. In other words, the bulk of the cost represents a transfer of income rather than a loss of efficiency. This calculation also emphasizes that, from a national point of view, VER are much more costly than tariffs. Given this fact, the widespread preferences of governments for VERs over other trade policy measures requires some careful analysis. Some voluntary export agreements cover more than one country. The most famous multilateral agreement is the multi-fiber arrangement, which limited textiles exports from 22 countries until the beginning of 2005. Such multilateral voluntary restraint agreements are known as Orderly Marketing Agreement, or OMA, but recent international trade agreements have prevented further use of this trade restrict.